This is episode 213 with Olie Hunter Smart. Olie tells the story of his Amazon River expedition, including what happens after you eat chicken foot soup and what masato tastes like. That's the yucca root drink traditionally fermented with saliva. Olie first appeared in episode 204, where he talked about his walk through India. If you enjoy this episode, you might want to check out the interview I did with West Hansen, who did a similar Amazon expedition. I interviewed West about that adventure in episode 38. Welcome to the Pursuit Zone podcast. I'm your host, Paul Schmid, and I interview explorers that dream big, break out of their comfort zones, and take on ambitious pursuits. Let's start the show, and let me introduce Olie. In 2015, with his friend Taryn, he completed an adventure along the Amazon River, traveling from the headwaters of the Rio Montaro, high in the Peruvian Andes, to the Atlantic Ocean in Brazil. It was 400 miles of trekking, followed by 3,600 miles of kayaking for 4.5 months. You can learn more about Olie and his adventures at oliehuntersmart.com. Olie Hunter Smart, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much. It's really nice to be talking again.
So, Olie, how did you come to be involved in this adventure?
Well, the idea wasn't actually mine. I was planning an expedition to paddle in a rowing boat, an ocean rowing boat around Britain, and I'd started actually training for that with a group of friends. But unfortunately, for a couple of reasons, that all fell through. And come sort of December 2014, I was looking for something else to sort of fill that void. And I heard about a trip that a guy was planning down the Amazon River, and I thought, oh, that would be an amazing journey to do. I love the jungle. The jungle is actually one of my favorite environments. I visited the Amazon previously when I was backpacking in 2014, earlier that year, actually. And I just wanted to have another reason to go back. And so I heard about this trip and eventually got introduced to Taryn, who was planning the journey. And we just kind of met up, chatted a couple of times and kind of tried to make it work, tried to make the dream become a reality.
When you met him, I mean, how far along was his planning and how much of the planning was left to go?
I mean, Taryn had done quite a bit of planning. He'd already made connections with some people that had done the journey previously. He'd already connected with a potential guide in Peru that we could use. But that was kind of about as far along as he'd got. He'd had a number of teammates sort of pull out as well, like I had done. And so I guess he was at that moment toying with the idea of doing it himself, but we just sort of, threw a few ideas about in terms of dates and how we might actually make it become a reality. And those plans ultimately aligned.
From when you met him to when you guys got on an airplane, how much time went by?
We met in, I think it was about the end of January, beginning of February, and we set off in June. So it was about 4 to 5 months of planning. There was a hell of a lot to do, though. We hadn't actually sourced any kayaks or worked out how to get out to the country. We hadn't really looked about how we, would get to the source. So there was a lot of general expedition planning that still needed to take place. So it was quite a busy 4 months.
Before you went down there, what were your biggest fears about the adventure?
I'd done some reading about people that had traveled down the Amazon, and we were in touch with a guy who'd done the expedition previously. And so we were warned about various aspects that we might need to be thinking about and prepare ourselves for. There's an area called the Red Zone in Peru. And this is an area that is controlled by the local tribe, but also narco traffickers. It's an area where 70% of the world's cocaine is produced. And so when you start hearing numbers like that, and I've seen documentaries about the cocaine production in that region, you think, oh, actually, this is going to be incredibly dangerous. And so that was probably the area that I was most concerned about. Speaking with the guys that had done the expedition previously, we knew that we had to get permits to travel through that area. We also found out that the military and the police both avoid patrolling in that area. For them, they consider it too dangerous and not really worth their time or effort. So that was definitely something that was bubbling away through my mind. I guess the other aspect that I was, concerned about was the fact that I'd never done an expedition of this scale before, and I didn't really know what to expect. But ultimately, I guess that's what an adventure is all about. It's that uncertainty, that unknown. I think that the biggest concern was the red zone.
You guys eventually get your things sorted out, and we'll talk more about the kayak and stuff later. But you get yourselves to Peru, and what city did you fly into?
We flew into Lima, which was the easiest place to get ourselves to. We had to actually change in Rio, the flights, the way the flights worked. And we, flew with actually most of our equipment that we were going to need for that journey. So we took a huge amount of luggage with us. I think it was 90 kilos each, something like that, of baggage. So, you can kind of imagine the stuff we were taking.
Okay, so now you have to get yourself to the starting point, to the source. So I guess, first of all, have you sourced any local help, any kind of guides or fixers to help you?
We did rely on some locals for some knowledge, and they were incredibly useful. We actually purchased our kayaks out in Peru. The reason is it's very difficult to ship 5-meter long kayaks anywhere around the world. And so, we managed to source some kayaks in Lima from a kayak club there. So, he was very useful in terms of telling us, about sort of the kayaking scene in Peru. We did also have the help of a guy called Cesar, who'd done the journey previously with the person that we were consulting with, a guy called West Hansen. And he'd done the journey through the red zone and right the way into Brazil previously. And so we sought his help as well. He was going to help us with the permissions that we were going to need. He knew the areas we were going to be traveling through. He knew what we would come up against, what we might be expecting. But also, he spoke the local language, and that I found is incredibly invaluable when you're trying to plan an expedition, because sometimes, as a foreigner, you don't necessarily get straight answers, or you get inflated prices and that sort of thing. And so having a local really help us plan the journey was invaluable.
How do you guys get from Lima up to the starting point where you're going to begin this 400-mile trek?
We spent about 2 weeks in Lima, and that was really so that we could finish planning our journey on the ground. There was quite a lot to organize, which we can kind of come on to. But ultimately, one of those things was trying to find out how we could actually get to the source of the River Amazon. And if you've never seen a river, the source of a river, which not many people have, they are quite difficult to locate. Ultimately, we had to catch a bus up to a city called Cerro de Pasco. It sits at 4,500 meters high up in the Peruvian Andes. The bus journey up there was about 8 or 10 hours overnight. And once we got there, we then had to try and catch a lift out to essentially the source of the Amazon. It was along a dirt track, and there were a couple of communities along that route. And we just kept on asking, how much further do we need to go to get to the source? We did have some GPS coordinates to help us, but ultimately we used that local knowledge to get us out there.
Okay, so you made it to the starting point. You have got probably pretty heavy packs at this point. What do your packs weigh?
Our packs were weighing about 40 kilos each. It was a huge amount of equipment that we were carrying with us. It was probably way too much than what we actually needed, but we were going to be walking through so many different climates. Starting at 4,500 meters, it was incredibly cold at nighttime. We had to have winter weight sleeping bags. It sort of got down to minus 10 degrees at nighttime. So we really needed those heavy duty sleeping bags. We also had, jackets and fleeces and that sort of thing as well, which all adds extra bulk. We had some camera equipment. We had the ambition of trying to film this journey. Unfortunately, we didn't come home with quite enough footage to actually make a huge amount of it. But we had a tripod, a camera, and then we had about 15 days worth of ration packs of food, dehydrated food that we were taking with us, particularly for the first week or so, week and a half. We were literally self-reliant. We didn't know really where communities that we were going to be passing through, and how much food that we'd be able to buy off them. So we wanted to make sure we were self-sufficient. And then, of course, you've got things like medical supplies as well. All of this kit just adds up.
Just one point I wanted to go back to was on the filming of it. What happened? Why didn't you guys end up with, enough footage?
I guess we just hadn't really planned it properly to film the expedition. And so we went out with this ambition of thinking, it'd be really nice to make a film off the back of this and have, a piece of content that we could share and use. Ultimately, we weren't capturing the right kinds of shots that you need to make a documentary. Quite often we were, because of the weight of our bags and some of the distances that we were traveling, it was quite difficult to keep ourselves motivated to keep the film rolling, to keep the camera rolling. And so we didn't capture enough content. And unfortunately, when we got back, I had a look through the footage and was like, we just haven't got enough substance here. There was a lot of, point of view stuff. So, or even, first person type stuff. So where the camera's pointing at us as we were walking, and that's when we were using GoPros. But there wasn't enough sort of shots of us walking through the scene and kind of establishing shots, I guess you'd call them.
Yeah. Yeah, I understand. I mean, you almost need a third person whose full-time job on the adventure is just to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, as I said, we didn't know what we were doing. So it was kind of no surprise, really, that we didn't come back with enough to be able to make a huge amount of it.
So let's go back to the food. And you're only able to carry so much food with you at a time. What is your guys' plan in terms of resupply? Are you somehow able to cache supplies in certain towns or villages, or are you hoping that you're just always going to be able to buy things when you run out?
Throughout the walking leg of the journey, we knew that the first week and a half was going to be remote. We were going to need to be self-sufficient. There was going to be nowhere where we could purchase food and so on. Once we'd hit the main road, we knew that there were going to be towns and villages that we were going to be passing through where we would be able to restock and resupply. So for the walking leg of the journey, we carried, it was about 15 days worth of dry ration packs and dehydrated ration packs. And all we had to do was just add boiling water to those, and our food was cooked within 8 to 10 minutes. We then relied on being able to eat in villages and towns as we got to them. That was great because we were getting fresh fruit and vegetables. We got to try local delicacies, things like guinea pig. Unfortunately, in the UK and US, it's very much a pet, but out in Peru, it's considered a food. Yeah, well, so we were able to keep ourselves kind of fed enough on the walking leg of the journey, just with what we could get along the route. Once we reached the river, we had to be self-sufficient because, again, we didn't know what supplies we'd be able to pick up in towns and villages. So we carried our dehydrated ration packs in our kayaks, and we had about 2 months worth of dehydrated food with us in our kayaks, and we'd sent a package of effectively the same, another 2 months worth of food and protein shakes down to a city called Iquitos, which was near the Peruvian and Brazilian border. So that was where we then resupplied. And that stock of food, that lasted us the next 2 months through the whole of Brazil.
Well, let's talk about this 400-mile trek that you guys are going on. What's it like? I mean, are you in the middle of some dense jungle? Or tell me about the terrain and what you're seeing when you're walking.
No, it's funny, actually. In my head, I was doing a jungle expedition. So I had, an idea that we would be able to stay in hammocks, sling them up between the trees, and I was going on a sort of a warm climate expedition. Obviously, the source starts at the top of the Peruvian Andes, so it's 4,000 meters up. There are no trees around at all. There are some llama grazing around just on the plateau up there. It's incredibly beautiful, sunny during the day, so it was nice and warm. It was maybe 10, 15 degrees during the day, but it did get incredibly cold at nighttime, as I said. And the terrain was actually, it looked very flat, but it was incredibly rugged and tough to walk through. There were huge boulders that we would have to climb over. There were these big tufts of grass that were very difficult to walk through or across. And when we planned the walking leg of the journey, we'd sort of thought we'd be able to do up to 20 miles a day. And that first week and a half, we were doing 10 or 12 miles a day. It was such slow progress. It ultimately added a huge amount of time to our expedition. And of course, at 4,500 meters up, you've got this altitude, which is a real killer. It feels like you're breathing through a straw. And certainly the first couple of days, we just didn't have we weren't able to get in enough oxygen into our bodies. So we really should have acclimatized for a couple of days up in the mountains at that altitude before we'd started walking with these heavy packs, these 40-kilo packs. But it was just beautiful. And then once we'd got through that sort of really tough terrain, we actually hit the road, and that became much easier. We were able to increase our distances up to sort of 15 to 20 miles a day. But we still had that undulating terrain, and it did hit 4,000 meters another 4 times. But yeah, we just got stronger and fitter as we were walking and progressing.
So if you're not able to use hammocks, did you guys have like a tent as a backup, or how were you sleeping each night?
Yeah, absolutely. So we took tents with us. We had 2 single-man tents. The reason we wanted single-man tents was just so that we had a bit of extra space in order to get our equipment inside the tents as we were sleeping, so that we weren't leaving anything outside, as it were. But yeah, we were just sleeping in regular tents, probably $50 tents from, a cheap outdoor store.
And what about water? How were you treating it?
We used water-to-go bottles. So they have a filter. It filters as you're drinking. So you just fill up the water bottle from a stream or river or a tap or anything, really. And it filters as you're drinking it. So it filters out sort of any bugs, bacteria, viruses, but also things like heavy metals as well. And that's actually something I was quite pleased with, because we did pass through a town called La Oira, and Red Bull named it one of the most polluted cities in the world, or towns in the world. It's a big mining town. You could see, huge plumes of smoke going up into the air. The whole area just looked very grey and dirty. And obviously they were using the river as their source of water for the mining. And so, anything was going back into that water we were then going to be consuming. So I was incredibly pleased that these water-to-go bottles were filtering out any of those heavy metals.
Did either of the two of you get sick over the 4.5 months?
Yeah, we did. It's kind of inevitable, really. We both picked up something called giardia, and we'd stayed with a family, and they'd given us some food, a bowl of caldo de gallina, which is essentially, it was chicken foot soup. We were both given this for breakfast, and we took it knowing it wasn't really going to give us the energy to kind of keep going for the morning, but we didn't really want to refuse it. Within about an hour of us both having that, we were both feeling pretty rough. We were burping up these really sulfurous burps. Taryn, shortly after, began throwing up on the side of the road, and it really, hit us hard. We actually had to stop and rest in another village for a day or so, where we then tried to find out, what was wrong with us, visited the doctor, we got some antibiotics, and we did slowly recover. But actually, giardia is a waterborne parasite, but it can also, come through in food if someone's been preparing the food that has giardia. So that's kind of what we think we had, and it's really difficult to get rid of. So that did kind of keep on reoccurring a couple of times throughout the journey.
Yeah, what happened then ultimately to get rid of it? Was it just getting the right dosage of antibiotics?
Yeah, it's a particular type of antibiotics, but it also depends how serious the bacteria is inside your stomach. I actually visited the Hospital of Tropical Diseases here in London when I got back, and they then gave me some incredibly strong antibiotics to get rid of it. I've actually had it since when I went to India, which I know we've obviously spoken about before. I had giardia there as well. This time I knew what the name of the antibiotics was, and I was able to buy it over the counter in India. So, but yeah, it's really not nice to have.
So eventually you guys make it to a point where you're going to begin kayaking, which I have in my notes here was on Peruvian Independence Day, July 28th. So you're about to start kayaking. Maybe this is a good point we can talk about the kayaks. What kind of kayaks or Olie, I guess I have several questions around the kayaks. The first question would be, do you have one kayak or there are two kayaks?
We took two sea kayaks. Ultimately, it was really difficult to get hold of the types of kayaks we needed for our expedition out in South America. In fact, it was really hard finding any kind of kayak in South America. It's just not something they use, really. But there was this kayak club in Lima where Taryn was in touch with them for quite a while, actually. And he managed to source these two kayaks, which I think probably came up from Chile. Tend to be a bit more kayaks in Chile. There were two 5-meter long kayaks, very similar in style, and they were sea kayaks. That was the thing we needed to be able to store all of the equipment and the food and so on that we were going to need for our journey.
What do you guys have for paddles?
We were sponsored by a paddle company, so we used TNP paddles. They were carbon fiber, so sort of super lightweight, but really strong. And we had a paddle each plus one spare paddle, which was definitely needed because Cesar actually managed to lose his paddle. So we ended up having to hand over this spare paddle to him.
Are you guys wearing life preservers every day?
Yeah, we did definitely wear life jackets every single day that we were out on the water. You know, you never know what's going to happen. So yeah, it was vital that we wore those life jackets.
So the paddles, the life jackets, you brought those from the UK?
Yes, we brought the paddles, the life jackets. We also took some ropes just in case, we needed to tie ourselves together to make a raft as well. We brought all of that safety equipment from the UK. We did take other safety equipment as well. We had things like a GPS tracker, a satellite phone, and they were really, our vital communications devices, really, to make sure that people were able to follow our journey, but also from a safety perspective that we had a way of communicating with the outside world should, something happen to us, which ultimately a couple of times we did rely on that equipment.
All right. So you sourced some 5-meter sea kayaks in Peru and got them situated where you wanted them so that you could get in and start this journey. I was going to ask you, what did the boats cost?
The boats cost us about $1,500 each. As I say, they were secondhand, so they weren't in top nick. And we did actually have to make a repair to one of them. It had been damaged in transit between Lima and the place we were going to start paddling, which was essentially where the river flattened out. We started there because we didn't have the whitewater experience, but also we knew that we'd need a support crew if we were traveling down the Whitewater River, because we wouldn't have been able to take all the food and equipment that we were going to need. So that's where we started. But yeah, we had to make a quick repair to one of the kayaks as it arrived in Pucallpa, where we started paddling.
What are the kayaks made out of?
The kayaks are made from fiberglass. They were pretty decent, solid structures, and they had a locker front and back. And so ultimately, we just had to source a fiberglass repair kit when we got to Lima, which was actually a big challenge, trying to find, the liquid, the resin that we could use and make sure that, it wasn't going to react with the air or the temperatures that we were going to be traveling through, so that should we, damage the kayak further downstream, then we could still make a repair.
How much kayak experience do you guys have at this point when you are about to set off on this 3,600 miles of kayaking?
That's a good question. We were very inexperienced in terms of kayaking. I actually grew up on the south coast here in the UK. So I've done a lot of windsurfing and paddleboarding and a little bit of kayaking, but I'd never done anything of this kind of distance. I hadn't really ever done any kind of multi-day paddling either. We did a couple of little bits and pieces of training when we were in the UK before we set off for Peru. But I wish I'd kind of done quite a bit more, because I think it would have been really helpful. We hadn't even done a training course in terms of how to roll your kayak, which is a pretty basic thing. But we've sort of figured that with the volume of kit that we had in each kayak, there was probably maybe 80 to 90 kilos worth of kit in each kayak that we weren't going to be able to roll the kayak anyway. So it was a case of our plan was to get out. We were paddling very close to the shore anyway. So we'd swim the kayak to the shore, empty it out and get back in that way.
I wanted to ask you about your guys' mood at this point, because you're just getting done with about 20 days plus or minus of trekking, and your feet probably hurt and your back's probably hurt from carrying those heavy backpacks. What are you feeling at this point? You're getting into these kayaks, you're starting this new part of the adventure. What was your mood like?
We were incredibly excited. This is the expedition that we'd sort of come for, and the walking part of the journey was really just a means to get to this point. We had grown much fitter and stronger as we'd been walking. I definitely remember my legs and my back were incredibly strong at this point, having been carrying all that weight for quite so long. And it was just really exciting to be able to get into the kayaks, mix things up. And, we just wanted to get through this red zone, which is the area, obviously, that had been, in our minds for quite a while, should we say.
So how soon do you hit the red zone?
We hit the red zone pretty much immediately. I think it was about a half a day to a day before we hit that red zone. And it really starts where the Rio Montaro actually joins the Rio Apurimac, which is the river that flows past the town Pucallpa, which is where we started paddling.
And I mean, what happens when you hit the red zone? Because you said you had to get permits and things like that. At what point do you start running into people on the river that are like questioning, what are you guys doing here?
Well, we had our guide Cesar, and he was the guy that helped us arrange the permits from the local tribe. And we'd also visited the military and the police in Pucallpa and explained what we were doing to effectively ask them, if there was anything that went wrong, could you help us out? And once we secured those permits, and it did take 2 or 3 days to get all of the permits and permissions lined up, we would just paddle along. It was a beautiful river to paddle along. It's relatively narrow. You can see each side. You can hear birds tweeting and bugs buzzing all over the place. You can smell fires burning in the forest as you're passing these little communities. The first time we were paddling along, and we sort of heard these little calls going down the river. And then a guy would pop out on the riverbank further downstream, and he'd have a shotgun pointed at us. And we thought, oh, what's this all about? It all seemed a bit hostile. And so we sort of, we paddled up to him. Cesar had warned us that this may happen. So we sort of paddled up to him, and the whole time the shotguns were trained on us. And we had to try and explain the journey we were doing, that we had the permissions, that we needed to be in this area from the head of the tribe. And quite often, this guy, they are Rondero. They're a local sort of self-governing police force from the tribe. And he wouldn't really care about the permits. All he wanted to know was, that he was protecting his village. And so we'd be taken up to meet the leader of the community, the head of the tribe in that village. And at that point, we then produced our permits, and it was amazing. The guns went away. We were then welcomed in. They wanted to show us around their village, their community, and they gave us this welcome drink, which is called Masato. And that's very much their way of sort of saying, you are welcome in our community.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about that Masato, because isn't that the drink where they use the saliva to help ferment it?
Yeah, it's absolutely horrible. The women in the community chew the yucca root and they spit it out into this big pot. And I'm talking, it's probably 100-liter pot. It's massive. And they just sit there, 5 or 6 of them will sit there chewing this yucca and then spitting it out into this pot. They then add water to it. They leave it for 4, 5, 6 days, depending on how alcoholic they want to make it. And it slowly ferments in the heat, and then they serve it. They drink it at any time of day, to be honest. So some days we were given this in the evening when we got to a community. Some days we were given it 9:30 in the morning, which is the last thing you want, having only just had your breakfast.
And of course, it's warm. I'm sure they're not chilling it with ice cubes for you.
No, it's definitely warm and it's still fermenting.
Uh,
Um,
did
it's really nasty.
did you know what it was before you tried some?
I didn't know.
Yeah, that's
I
probably
wish I had done.
that's probably good because if you knew, I don't know if I could mentally, I'm drinking other people's spit. I can't deal with it.
Yeah, but it's one of those things like you're given this welcome drink, um, you have to kind of take it. But also, if you finished your bowl and they gave you these in huge sort of carved out gourds, if you finished your bowl too quickly, they would then refill it. They'd think, oh, you're enjoying it. There were a couple of nights where we were given, three, four, five bowls each, and I sipped mine as slow as I possibly could, but they kept on topping it up and giving us more and more and more until we went to bed. It was just makes me kind of get all covered in goosebumps thinking about it.
Oh man. Well, what happens to what was his name, Cesar, at this point? Because at some point, you guys, the escort changes or something. And you're getting escorted by the Peruvian Marines.
Yeah, so we got through the red zone, completely unscathed. In fact, the red zone was nowhere near as dangerous as we'd anticipated, because we got those permissions, and it was just such a beautiful environment to be traveling through. The area after the red zone is an area that is notorious for pirates, and again, it's very unruly. So that again, the military or the police don't really go into that area. And we'd hired Cesar as a guide for about a month. And in reality, the red zone had taken us maybe 9 days to get through. And so he was going to keep going all the way down to a town called Iquitos, which is where he was from. But sort of 2 days into this pirate zone, we were just paddling in the morning. It had been a really nice morning. There was a bit of mist across the river. And, Cesar was right behind me as we went down this small rapid. And then about 5 minutes later, I turned around and he was nowhere to be seen. And I sort of thought, well, that's really weird because he was definitely there next to me. So I kept on paddling a bit thinking, oh, maybe he got ahead of me and I didn't notice. And I caught up with Taryn, who was ahead of me. We stopped for a bit. We looked around, couldn't see Cesar anywhere. So we continued downstream a bit and we got to the junction of two rivers. And there was a boat there and we asked whether they'd seen anyone in a kayak like ours, and they said no, we haven't seen anyone. And so by this stage we hadn't seen Cesar for sort of an hour or so, and so we paddled back upstream to the point where I'd last seen him, and literally couldn't find him anywhere. We popped into a little village to ask them if he was, or to see if he was there, and there was no sign of him at all. So by this stage we'd spent about 4 hours looking for him, and we decided that he must have just continued downstream, thinking we weren't far behind him. Ultimately, we didn't come across him again, and it was 3 days later that we found out from the guy that had used him as a guide previously that Cesar had caught a boat downstream to a town called Pucallpa. That was ultimately where he'd caught a boat down to, and we would next see him. He was obviously aware that we were traveling through this area that was notorious for pirates, and so on our last day, as we were coming into that town, he'd actually arranged for the Peruvian military to come and shadow us as we got into that area. He knew that there were some sort of dangerous villages and towns just upstream from there, and he felt like we needed the military support. In reality, we'd already passed those towns and villages. We set off, 4 a.m. that day to get past those before it got light. And so we actually only had them shadowing us for a couple of hours as we pulled into that city. And then he'd also arranged for them to shadow us for about 2 or 3 days after that city, it was actually really frustrating because they restricted the distance that we could do each day. They had in their head set places they wanted us to be staying. If we got there at midday, then that's as far as we would go each day. So eventually we did negotiate with them and said, look, we don't really need your support. We're kind of completely fine with our journey and the area we're traveling through. And so we did part ways. So we did have the Peruvian military shadowing us, which was quite cool.
Now, you mentioned getting shotguns pointed at you, which is scary. But you also had mentioned when I was reading through some of the information that you sent me about this adventure that you would come across sometimes people that would drag their fingers across their throat kind of motion, like, it's like the universal symbol for I'm going to cut your throat. So that's pretty scary. I mean, what was that all about?
Yeah, that was terrifying. It happened a couple of times along the river, and ultimately we thought that it meant that, they were potentially going to kill us. That's how we interpreted it. As it happens, since getting back, I actually did some research on that, and I've since learned that ultimately white men used to go to South America and they used to harvest organs. They used that motion to indicate the fact that they knew that we were white men, and in their eyes, we were there to harvest organs, and therefore they were watching us. Should we try and attack any one of them and ultimately harvest their organs? They used to call white people face peelers for that exact reason. But yeah, that is, as I understand, the reason why they were doing this sort of this drag motion across their throats, to just warn us that, we were not a danger to them, I think.
You guys eventually make it to Iquitos. What is it like in Iquitos, and what do you do when you get there?
Iquitos is a relatively big city. There's no roads into or out of the city. You have to fly there. It's right slap bang in the middle of the jungle. So you either have to fly there or you have to have taken a boat downstream or upstream to get there. But it is this incredible sort of colonial outpost, really. Beautiful buildings along the edge of the river. It looks very Mediterranean. It's nice and warm, but there's all of the amenities that you may want. So there's, bars and restaurants and hotels and a lot of motorbikes and cars and that sort of thing. And it was really our chance to rest. By this stage, we'd been on the river for sort of a month and a half, and our bodies had started to show signs of wear and tear, really. We had, bits and pieces, particularly between our fingers and around our toes, of rot. They'd been so exposed and ultimately sat in water for so long that, they'd started to show signs of rot, and we really had to try and dry ourselves out. This was also the place where we were going to resupply with the package that we'd sent on to ourselves. So we spent some time, repacking our kayaks, working out what equipment we had been using over the last month that we needed to keep, but also what we could get rid of. Ultimately, we tried to make our kayaks as light as possible so we could carry as much food as we could.
How long were you in Iquitos?
We spent about 3 days in the town itself. Again, we met up with the military just to check what was coming up in terms of towns and villages that may be a little bit dangerous for us. And that was really useful because there were a couple of military checkpoints that we could stop off at. As we passed them, we popped in there, explained who we were, and they said, "Oh yeah, we've been expecting you, we've been looking out for you." They then fed us, which was amazing, getting fresh food. And then once we reached the town called Santa Rosa, which is the tri-border town where we would have to get our exit stamp for Peru and get our entry stamp for Brazil, the Peruvian military actually let us store our kayaks there with them as well. So we spent 3 days in Iquitos just sort of doing all that admin. We actually then spent 3 days in a jungle lodge as well. Because we were essentially on a river expedition, we hadn't really had that opportunity to experience the rainforest and the jungle. And Cesar is a guide, he's a jungle guide. So he arranged for us to go to a jungle lodge, and we went on some sort of relatively small treks through the rainforest. We saw some of the wildlife that we hadn't been experiencing. And it was just, very, very relaxing 3 days in the jungle.
So after you left Iquitos, you hit the tri-border town. Did you say it was Santa Rosa?
Santa Rosa is the tri-border town in Peru. You've also got a town called, I've forgotten the name of it. But there's a Colombian town as well, the same in Brazil. And you can literally hop between all three of them within a matter of hours. And that's what we did. We actually stayed in the Colombian town because it was much more friendly. There were decent restaurants and places to stay. The Brazilian side is a little bit more dangerous, but we obviously had to go there to get our entry stamp into Brazil. And the Peruvian is very much a checkpoint, as it were. There wasn't much there. There was nowhere to stay. We just had to get our exit visa, exit stamp, and obviously the military were there to sort of help us as well.
How many days down the river from Iquitos was this tri-border area?
It was about 7 or 8 days to get down there. So yeah, it really wasn't very far. And actually one of those days we did camp on a sandbank on the Colombian side of the border, which was quite interesting because we stayed, it was literally on a sandbank, but for some reason someone came down to us and they then threatened to get the Colombian military to come and arrest us because we were staying there illegally ultimately, because we didn't have permission to be in Colombia. But one side of the river is Peruvian, one side is Colombian, and we just happened to pick the wrong side.
You cross the border into Brazil, and you've got now about 2 months to go to the end of your expedition. At some point here, I have it in my notes that you were on the river 21 days in a row with no break. What was it like during those 3 weeks?
I'd guess we'd got into a routine by this stage. We were very much paddling day in, day out. We would stop for a break sort of mid-morning and another one around about lunchtime. But yeah, we would just keep on paddling. There were villages that we were passing and we would stop in them every now and again just to see what food they had in their shops. We kind of needed a few little supplies to keep us moving forwards. But also, we wanted to see the communities that we were passing through. It was a good 21 days, though, because we could see the progress we were making. We were kind of cracking through it, really.
As you're moving along, the river is getting wider. Is it becoming difficult at this point to navigate and determine where you're going?
No, not really. We'd been very fortunate. One of the previous expeditions had given us some maps, which are the navigational charts for the river. So we knew where the bends were coming up, where the islands were that sat in the river, where there were shortcuts that we could take, around the bends. So it was relatively straightforward to actually navigate. There were a couple of times where we, spoke to fishermen and asked whether we could take shortcuts and that sort of thing. And it's quite funny, their knowledge of the river varied. Sometimes that, they said, yeah, absolutely, you can go down those shortcuts. Sometimes we would try and go down them. And because the river recedes throughout the dry season. And so, the corners, the shortcuts that we were trying to take and they'd guided us down ultimately had dried up. So we then had to paddle back upstream to then continue on the main channel or try and find another shortcut that we could take.
What are you seeing on the river at this point? Is it pretty crowded with other boats?
Not a huge number of other boats. I mean, there were some, I guess there are passenger boats that do go between the various towns and cities. The river is deep enough and wide enough to accommodate those, but they're not so frequent. We maybe saw 2 or 3 a day. A lot of wildlife in terms of bird life, actually, and they tend to be on the islands that we were camping on. I remember seeing these incredible storks, absolutely ginormous birds on some of the islands that we stayed on. A lot of driftwood. Obviously, as the river's receding, these new islands pop out and there's bits of driftwood and incredible sand formations on these islands. But yeah, it's sort of a very peaceful and tranquil place. Just a couple of fishermen every now and again near the communities, as I say. But yeah, it was nice.
Yeah, those birds like storks and herons, and they're very strange when you see them up close. Yeah,
incredible creatures, but yeah, not the prettiest.
Eventually you come into the city of Manaus. I'll call it a city. I don't know exactly. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. What's it like when you get there?
Manaus is huge. We were in our relatively small 5-meter long kayaks that they'd very much been our homes for sort of the last 2.5 months as we were coming into Manaus. So it was very difficult for us to find a place to come into the city and to store our kayaks while we were going to stay there for a couple of days. Manaus is such a vast city. I think there's about 5 or 6 million people that live there. There are ocean-going cargo ships that go ultimately from Manaus down out of the river mouth. So huge, great boats. There's a big manufacturing economy there that, stuff gets sent around Brazil, around the world. So it really was a very odd place to try and kayak into. But there is a really nice old town. It's got an incredible opera house that was ultimately built using money from rubber barons back in the late 1800s and early 1900s. But it wasn't a particularly nice place that we wanted to spend a huge amount of time. It was really just, give ourselves a bit of a break from some of the long days and long stretches that we'd had without having breaks previously.
You're getting closer to the mouth of the river. I mean, what's happening at this point in terms of because at some point you're going to start having to deal with, I guess, with tides and the effect of that. And so what's it like on the river as you're getting closer and closer to the mouth?
It's incredibly wide by this stage. It's sort of 8 or 9 miles wide. So that's further than you can see when you're sat down in your kayak. So you can't see the other side of the riverbank. So we very much had to pick a side and stay with it. Obviously, I've mentioned these huge ocean-going cargo ships that are going down the river. They are traveling at speeds that they couldn't stop easily. It's highly unlikely they'd even actually see us. And so we had to make sure that we were sort of well clear of them as well. Once you get a bit further down, there is an island that sits in the river mouth that is the size of Switzerland. It is vast, and it's got all of these little tributaries and passageways through. And from that moment on, we really felt the impact of the tide. And so a lot of the land has now been consumed by mangroves. All of the villages that we would stop in are built up on stilts. And so we would have to rely on these communities, pull into them, ask people if we could stop and wait for the tide to turn again. We had to change our whole routine to a kind of a 6 hour on, 6 hour off cycle, which was a completely different kind of drain on us. We had to make sure that we were near communities, and it was very difficult to know where communities were and at what point the tide was going to turn, because obviously we were traveling forwards. We didn't know if we were traveling at the right speed and whether we'd set off, as the tide was turning, or whether we'd waited a bit too long and therefore we were only going to have 5 hours of an outgoing tide before it turned again. So it was very difficult to kind of predict. And we also, as I say, did 6 hours on, 6 hours off. So that meant we had to do some night navigation. We were paddling through the nights with our head torches, which was very difficult, very disorientating. But ultimately, that was the only way we could keep moving forwards and complete the expedition. In amongst the mangroves, you also get pirates. So they hide out in the mangroves. They think they're well hidden. And we pulled up to one village one night and we were staying in that community. Suddenly the locals came over to us and told us to turn our head torches off. We were just making our dinner and settling in for the evening. And they rushed over and told us to turn the head torches off. And we watched one of these huge container ships as it was robbed by these pirates. And they threw a rope ladder over the side. One of them climbed up with a gun. And, these boats have security guards on them, but the pirates are incredibly ballsy and they just go for it. 2 or 3 minutes, they're saying, a lot of screaming, a lot of shouting, hand over all your electronics. So they're not after the cargo. And then they jump off, back down the rope ladder, back into a little boat, and off they disappear into the mangroves again. And it was just incredible to watch that happening from the side. I couldn't believe that we were that fortunate not to have any issues with pirates at all throughout our whole journey. But we did get to see it happening right in front of us.
Your final day of paddling is described as 22 hours of paddling on the boat. Describe that last day for me.
Oh, it was absolutely shattering. We set off at about 10 p.m. Because of the tides. We'd been on the sandbanks since about 4 or 5 p.m. in the afternoon. So we packed up our tents, we got some food into the cockpits of our kayaks so that we could stop at some point throughout the night and have a bit of a rest. And off we set, and we paddled through the night, and we were very lucky with the way the moon was working. So we were guided by this almost full moon. which was incredible. We weren't far off reaching the mouth of the river by about 6 o'clock in the morning. So we pulled up onto this sandbank knowing that the tide was about to turn. It was getting much harder to paddle forwards. So we pulled up onto this sandbank and thought, well, we might be able to get our tents out to get a couple of hours sleep. We got out onto the sandbank, and within about 3 minutes, our ankles were deep in water. And we were like, oh, there's no way we can pull over here. So we then paddled over to the mangroves, and we ultimately had to hang on to the mangrove branches as the tide rose. And it was flowing, at a relative pace. So it was quite tough to be able to stay in the same position and hang on for that long, particularly having been paddling all night. We were doing that for about 6 hours, until the tide started to turn and flow outwards again. And we just nudged our noses out to make sure that the tide had turned properly. And then off we went. We headed out again very quickly on the outgoing tide. And we managed to paddle straight onto this huge sandbank that we weren't really expecting to be there. Obviously, the tide was flowing out, so it was getting shallower and shallower. So we then had to quickly paddle back, and we followed what we felt was and there were loads of fishing boats out just sort of along the edge of this sandbank. So we followed those out to the Atlantic Ocean. And we were really just looking for some GPS, looking at GPS coordinates to see how far out we'd gone. And essentially, the next piece of land east that we would have seen would have been Africa. So that's how far we needed to get our kayaks out. And it took us about 8 hours to get out to that point. It was a really weird experience when you kind of think, yes, we've hit those GPS points, because there was no sight of any land anywhere near us. The sea was incredibly rough. Obviously, you got the tide was sort of bouncing around, wind against tide, bouncing us around. We had these huge waves, which were sort of 15-foot walls of water that were crashing around. And it was absolutely terrifying being out in the middle of nowhere. And nobody really knew we were there, ultimately. So we had to then spend the next 8 hours paddling back towards land and up a river channel before we could actually get out of our kayaks and celebrate properly with a beer. But it was such an incredible feeling when we had finally reached that moment, because, two guys hadn't a huge amount of kayaking experience. We didn't really have any kind of big expedition experience either. And we'd actually achieved something that very few people have ever done, particularly as we did it self-supported with very little, local guides or support at all.
Yeah, congratulations on getting it done.
Thank you. Yeah, it's still very surreal thinking back to some of the stories and the moments that I've been able to share with you today. Sometimes I do sort of think, God, was that really me?
Then what happens after? I mean, how do you guys plan your exit out?
We'd pre-arranged with a kayak club in the city of Belém, which is a city that sits on the mouth of the Amazon. We'd pre-arranged with a kayak club there that we would ultimately donate our kayaks, or they were going to purchase them off us at a very good rate. So we were fortunate that the club owner had agreed to meet us in the town São Caetano, which is where we'd pulled up to that at the end of that incredibly long day. Yeah, we loaded the kayaks onto his trailer. He then drove us into the city of Belém. We spent a night with him celebrating and sort of organising all of our gear. And then we actually flew back down to Rio the following day. So we didn't really spend much time in Belém itself. But yeah, it was nice to be able to have a beer and celebrate.
Well, Olie, what was your biggest lesson learned or the biggest takeaway from the adventure?
I've got a couple, really, I think. One is how incredibly lucky we were. I talked about pirates at the end there, but there were threats of pirates throughout the whole journey. We'd obviously travelled through the red zone, which, as I said, was safer than we'd kind of imagined. But we actually were very lucky. We came up against very few sort of big challenges like that, or threats, as it were. The second thing I think I learned was the importance of teamwork on an expedition like this. Taryn and I didn't know each other before we left that well. we ultimately had the same dream, the same vision to get to the end. And we really had to make it work. You know, you're going through so many highs and so many lows on an expedition like that. And it's impossible to stay positive the whole time. You don't know how the other one's feeling. You don't know whether they've, you know, if they're sick or they're just finding things a bit of a challenge. And so you do rely on the other person to kind of keep you motivated, keep you moving forwards, keep that drive. But also being two guys from, both spoke English, both having the same kind of experience, means that we ultimately were sharing those moments and kind of enjoying those moments together. And so, you know, being part of a team is incredibly important, I think, and just being able to help each other through it.
Yeah, we didn't mention too much or talk too much about Taryn. I should have probably asked a little more about him at the start, but were you guys about the same age?
Taryn was a little bit younger than I was. So I think he was about 30 when we set off. I was 32. And yeah, he'd grown up in the UK, he's Australian, but spent a lot of time in the UK as he was growing up.
Do you two still keep in touch?
We do a little bit. It's funny. It's one of those things. Obviously, we went through this incredible experience together, but ultimately, you know, we kind of drifted apart as we have different things going on in our lives at the moment. So yeah, we don't actually speak very often.
Well, Olie, where are your interests going to take you next?
It's a really great question. I did off the back of this journey. I actually wanted to go and do a solo journey through India, which we've obviously spoken about before. I really enjoyed, you know, that had much more of a purpose to the journey than the Amazon journey did. And I also filmed it as well. I did ultimately learn what kinds of shots I needed to be capturing in order to make a documentary of it. So that is something that I have kind of got more interest in now, I guess, is making stories and content to be able to share with people. And I really want to do a lot more of that. I've got an idea for Southern Africa, which ultimately involves people, but also, learning more about the culture and the communities that we're traveling through, as opposed to kind of a mammoth expedition through an incredibly tough environment. And I think that's what really piques my interest now is learning about cultures and communities and people. Southern Africa's is high on the list. We'll just have to see if I can make it happen once COVID sort of starts to die away, really.
How can people contact you if they want to learn more about you and your adventures?
Well, there's my website, oliehuntersmart.com. It's OLIE, Hunter Smart. But also Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Just get in touch any of those ways. Send me a DM and I'll get back to you.
Olie Hunter Smart, thank you so much for coming back on the show once again and sharing the story of this Amazon River expedition. It was great to hear about it. Very exciting, and best of luck to you on your future expeditions.
Thanks very much. Yeah, it's been really nice sharing it again with you.
Thank you again for listening. This episode was recorded on April 12th, 2021. If you want to write to me to send me some feedback, my email address is paul@thepursuitzone.com. You can also leave me a voice message by either recording a message with your phone and emailing it if you want to have a chance to get your voice on the show, or you can also do so by using SpeakPipe, and you do so by going to speakpipe.com/thepursuitzone. The best way, as always, to support the podcast is to help spread the word and let other people know about it. Be sure to follow The Pursuit Zone anywhere you get your podcast content. And to find out more info about this episode and others, head on over to thepursuitzone.com.